Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our discussion of American cultural history. We've been talking about the crisis of masculinity that afflicted the nation around the turn of the century in 1900. In the last lecture, we talked about one man who combated this decline of masculinity, the President Teddy Roosevelt. And in this lecture, we turn to another man who transformed the possibilities of the American human body, the bodybuilder Eugen Sandow. Displaying nude or nearly nude images of men or women in the Victorian age was a potentially risky business. Appropriately tasteful, fig-leafed, or carefully covered bodies could pass as art. Nude figures could be appropriate. Missing the mark on appropriate displays, though, might lead one into the realm of simply naked or early versions of pornography. It took the perfect man to walk this line. Eugen Sandow. Sandow arrived in the United States in June of 1893, 1 month after the United States stock market had crashed and the economy plunged into recession. The panic of 1893 lingered for most of the rest of the decade. In the midst of this depression, American men, many of them unemployed, felt their manhood and value to the nation tested. Sandow arrived at that moment to help rescue man's sense of self-worth. He was an acrobatic strongman of the English music hall stage before coming to America. His first appearances were at the Casino Roof Garden in New York City, an exclusive club. It was the wealthy who saw Sandow first. Sandow's first act is worth describing, and it's roughly portrayed in the two pictures on your screen. He came onto the stage following one of the most popular performers of the era, in one of his most famous starring roles. Henry Dixie was trim, handsome, and clean-cut. He was well known as a stage actor. At the time, he was performing the lead role in a play called Adonis, in which he was silent. During the play, he began as a statue, which was brought to life by the woman who sculpted him. He is, supposedly, in this play, the perfect man. After springing to life, Dixie's Adonis engages in all manner of farcical activities, cross-dressing and so on, before eventually returning to his original statue form. Dixie had performed the play hundreds of times and became famous for it. He was the perfect man. Then, Eugen Sandow arrived on the scene. The curtain closed on Dixie and rose a few minutes later to the fig-leafed perfect form of Sandow. At first, people in the crowd were uncertain what had happened. Dixie's Adonis had transformed again into a real Adonis. The Sandow figure couldn't possibly be real. And then he began to move, posing, flexing, and eventually lifting things. The performance evoked gasps from the crowds. So unreal was Sandow's body. In figurative terms, Sandow had replaced Dixie as the Adonis, the ideal man. One observer wrote, "New York has come to look upon Dixie as a fairly well-made young man. When New York has seen Sandow after Dixie, however, New York will realize what a wretched, scrawny creature the usual well-built gentleman is compared with the perfect man." Sandow's act was, even by modern standards, incredible. He would hold 56-pound dumbbells in each hand, lifting them over his head and in various positions with ease. He would leap a backflip while holding the dumbbells. He would heft baskets with people in them, and as his grand finale would bend over and support a beam that might support a whole group of people, or horses and other animals, or anything indicating vast amounts of weight. Sandow instantly came to be regarded as the ideal man. From 1893 to 1906, Sandow toured the United States almost constantly. He won over elite crowds at first, superseding the Victorian image of the ideal male. slender, pale, bookish, Dixie at his best. Then he conquered the masses, whose previous ideal of a powerful man was the circus strongman, barrel-chested, big-bellied, and huge. No one had ever seen a perfectly sculpted body like Sandow's. In virtually every picture and performance, he appeared nude or nearly nude, again pushing the boundaries of respectability. Had his form not been so perfect, as a nation, we might have blushed to realize we were looking at a naked man. Instead, we were viewing a nude Adonis. Born in Prussia in 1867 to a fruit and vegetable salesman, Sandow also came to represent the important theme of metamorphosis. Depending on who was telling the story, as a boy, Sandow was somewhere on the spectrum of thin, weak, meek, and sickly. It's hard to decipher reality from legend, but suffice it to say that his muscular build came from years of heavy lifting and hard work. A generation of bodybuilders who followed Sandow claimed to be inspired by him. To a man, those who entered the so-called iron game of lifting and bodybuilding said they either saw Sandow in person or were inspired by pictures and stories about him. Charles Atlas, pictured here, who was crowned the world's most perfect man in 1921, had kept a picture of Sandow pinned to his wall since 1909. For Sandow, Teddy Roosevelt, Atlas, and many others, it's critical to note that they altered themselves. By sheer force of will and determination, they were transformed from weakling to strongman. This becomes a powerful metaphor for the nation itself. Sandow himself claimed to be inspired by viewing the classical Roman sculptures on a visit to Rome at the age of 10. He wondered why men of that forgotten age appeared to be so strong and muscular, while men of his age were not. He determined to transform himself into a godlike figure. He adopted a very sophisticated, even scientific approach to sculpting his own body. He consulted with doctors and experts on human physiology. He wasn't only lifting heavy weight, he was targeting specific muscle groups with particular exercises, a practice decades before its time and completely unprecedented to that point. At the same time Sandow's career evolved, he was sure to always maintain an aura of respectability. He was clean-cut and clean-shaven. Most of the time, aside from his performances, he appeared in suits or tuxedos. He was well-spoken and respectful. In this way, he distinguished himself from the circus strongmen and sideshow hulks. Sandow became an equally adroit student of sportsmanship and professionalism. Linking himself to other top performers of his era, he chose October 29, 1889, as the moment to announce himself to the world. Situated in the crowd at the performance of the day's leading strongman in London, Charles A. Sampson, Sandow responded to what had become Sampson's famous challenge to the crowd at the end of his show. He would give anyone in the crowd who could match his feats of strength 500 pounds, their equivalent of dollars. Over a series of shows, he matched Sampson feat for feat, bending and snapping iron bars, lifting outrageously heavy objects, and so on. Sampson eventually conceded, beaten. From that moment until he arrived in the United States in 1893, Sandow was Europe's preeminent strongman. Sandow is the perfect man at the perfect time and place to reinvent our image of masculinity. In the age of the stage performance and vaudeville, Sandow's performances were overwhelmingly physical. He communicated with his body and his muscles as much as with words. He was close enough to the crowd for them to be awestruck, but far enough away that they might not notice certain stage tricks. His performances endured long enough to have a profound impact, but unlike today, they weren't recorded and re-aired endlessly over the internet for people to scrutinize every flaw. And simply, he did stand head and shoulders above everyone else at the time. While some aspects of his performance may have been aided by stage tricks or photography tricks, Even with such gimmicks, he delivered an incredible performance. Sandow also blended well with regular folks. A favorite part of his act came to mingle in the crowd dressed in a suit coat with everyone else, gradually making his way to the stage, where only after he removed his outer clothing did the crowd realize his incredible build. This was another sort of metamorphosis, another way that men and boys could fantasize about taking off their clothes and revealing a Sandow-like sculpted body. Sandow became something of a walking anatomy chart. He delighted in subjecting himself to inspection by doctors. As part of his act, he named and showed off every muscle group, in an age when most people never even thought about such things. His build was impressive even by modern standards, although he would never draw a second look in the age of steroids today. By the standards of that era, he was utterly incredible. As another contrast, we might consider the appearance of the heavyweight boxing champion of that era, John L. Sullivan, who was considered by some the perfect man. He was nicknamed the Boston Strong Boy. Sullivan reigned as champion from 1882 to 1892. Like the strongmen of the day, often issuing open challenges to anyone in the audience, and always winning. Sullivan was huge by the standards of the day, about 5'11" and 236 pounds. Sandow, by contrast, was about 5'8" and 190 pounds. Sullivan's undeniable strength and power derived from years of lifting barrels of flour and kegs of nails. His build, however, is clearly eclipsed by Sandow, as you can see in the pictures on your screen. Both of these champions underwent examination by the leading physician of physical fitness of that era, Dudley A. Sargent. Sargent was a former circus performer who understood the rigors of physical training, who also became one of the great advocates of physical fitness and physical education in that era. Sargent has been called by some the John the Baptist of fitness, one who was at the forefront of preaching the positive benefits of physical activity and exercise. He also believed it was possible for man to work towards physical perfection, though for most of us, repetitive tasks in humdrum workplaces make such achievements impossible. Sargent set out to find the perfect man, examining dozens of leading athletic figures of the day. Sullivan proved to be less than perfect. Sullivan, once the ideal physical man, clearly falls short in comparison with Sandow. His body is merely that of a naked man. Sandow is the nude sculpture. Excerpts from Sargent's report bear repeating. Sandow is the most wonderful specimen of man I have ever seen, Sargent wrote. He is strong, active, and graceful, combining the characteristics of Apollo, Hercules, and the ideal athlete. I might add that he combines with his other qualities that of a perfect gentleman. Moving on from New York, Sandow performed in Boston before moving on to the city where his nationwide fame was truly launched, Chicago, and the 1893 World's Fair. There he starred in a 3-month run at the Trocadero Theater, which was owned by Florence Ziegfeld. Sandow helped to launch the career and respectability of Ziegfeld, who remained a leading figure in show business until his death in 1932. Ziegfeld provided Sandow with the stage and the bombast to become a national sensation. Ziegfeld invited Sandow to be examined and re-examined by physicians, allowed spectators to examine the stage and props used during the show, and sold outrageously priced tickets to exclusive shows in which spectators could touch Sandow, measure themselves next to him, and so on. Sandow also starred in The Right Place and the Right Time in another vein, racial supremacy. In the age of immigration, there was great concern about the decline of pure Anglo-Saxon stock. At the World's Fair, viewers could observe people from many different nations, some of whom were on display in zoo-like fashion. This was also true of the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. Compared to all of these other sideshows, Sandow stood in his awesome white in an era when many were concerned about the decline of Anglo-Saxon stock. Sandow seemed to be proof of its continued dominance. Sandow also represents one of the contradictions in the culture of this era. He was often shown, nearly nude, in the presence of fully clothed spectators, both men and women, ogling him and even running their hands over him. Some wrote critically of him and of this practice, and yet his body appeared again and again in such photographs, indicating a repressed sexuality that surged through Victorian culture. Sandow was, indeed, by far the most photographed person of the age. He also appeared in 1894 in some of Thomas Edison's early kinetoscope films, along with other early films. His photographs were usually carefully staged. He recreated many classical sculptures with himself as the subject. These photographs were often sold as prints or postcards, and they sold by the many thousands across the country. Despite warnings by officials that inappropriate material was subject to confiscation, Sandow's pictures were never subjected to it. Again, Sandow was considered a work of art, not a naked man. Sandow toured the United States until 1906, retiring from performances in his early 40s. For a time, he carried on his advocacy of strength training by selling equipment and tutorials. He eventually retired to England, assisting the Royal Army in its training during World War I. Sandow died at the age of 58 in 1925 in England. Ironically, it was a feat of strength that killed him. When lifting a car off an injured victim, he suffered a brain hemorrhage and died not long after. In our next lecture, we'll talk about yet another figure who represented a new masculinity at the turn of the century, the magician Harry Houdini.